because Jesus clearly enters upon a Jewish heritage, if you like, an Israelitish heritage. He doesn't bring the gospel out of nothing. And so it's fair to ask the question, where does this gospel idea come from? Paul knew this well in Galatians 3:8. He says, the gospel was preached ahead of time to Abraham, the father of the faithful. He speaks in Romans 4 about the faith of Abraham. That's to say, the faith system, the belief system, that's what faith is, of Abraham. And he says that Abraham believed the gospel. That's amazing, isn't it? So then one would go straight to Abraham's life to see what it was he believed. And that's very clear. He believes in faith, sheer belief in what God saying being true. That's what it was. Go to a land that you've never seen. He doesn't know where he's going, but God said it, he does it. That's the Great Commission. And the land then, this is the great key, the land promised to Abraham becomes the kingdom of God promised in the New Testament. It's the same thing. Doesn't matter whether you say, as Jesus did, blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the land. Abraham was promised the land. Or if you say, blessed are the righteous, they're going to inherit the kingdom. Same thing. That's a great key. The term kingdom of God is the central heart of Jesus' message. Fail to understand the kingdom, you really misunderstand the whole story, the whole Christian story.
We are going to polish rainbows in heaven and tend heavenly gardens and prepare heavenly dishes.
We're longing for the dead to be restored to life. If they're already living, what do you need a kingdom for? In fact, it was William Tyndale who, believing in the sleep of the dead, said to the Pope, he said, you Pope, you keep putting souls in heaven. Let me ask you this, Mr. Pope, he said. What's the point of the resurrection? It's a great question. That was William Tyndale, who was burned alive for translating the Bible. What a world is religion. It's one of the cruelest things imaginable. It suggests there's something of great import here going on because of the sheer clash of ideas, the fury that some of these ideas produces. There's no doubt that the kingdom then is the basis of everything Jesus said. I mean, that is so obvious, it's almost painful. Any translation of the Bible would show you that. You'd have to have a reading ability of a 10-year-old to see that. But astonishingly, when we go to the computer and Google in what is the gospel, we've got a whole lot of experts, so-called, out there telling us. The gospel of the kingdom is not mentioned once. This has got to be the most riveting piece of information you could gather from the internet, quite honestly. How is this possible? When Jesus always preached the kingdom, he said, the kingdom gospel is why I was sent. Everything's about the kingdom, the parables of the kingdom, the treasure of the kingdom. He says every professional theologian who gets the kingdom in his heart is bringing marvelous treasures out of the old and the new, right? The old heritage in the Old Testament and the new things of the new covenant. It's all about the kingdom. That is so obvious once you see it. And yet when you go and Google in what is the kingdom, and you hear these leaders of evangelical colleges, evangelical churches and so on, famous names, and guess what? They're attempting to answer the question, what is the gospel? And you listen with bated breath. You wonder, what's coming next? And what do you hear? The gospel is Jesus died and rose. Died for sins and rose. Wait a minute. I've just been reading in 30 chapters in Matthew, Mark and Luke, 30 chapters, all about preaching the gospel. Not a word about the death and resurrection. Isn't it, man? I want to repeat that. 30 chapters, if you add up Matthew, Mark and Luke. Before you get to Matthew 16:21, where Jesus, in the last third of his ministry, says, now I'm going to tell you something I've not told you before. We're going up to Jerusalem. I'm going to get killed, and I'm going to rise again. And yet he had been preaching the gospel, Christianity, for 30 chapters without saying a word about the death and resurrection that was coming later. That must prove to the unprejudiced observer that there's more to the gospel than the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's astonishing. I wrote to a distinguished leader of a leading Bible college, and I asked him about the gospel of the kingdom and the gospel of grace, and he said quite dogmatically, the gospel of the kingdom is not the same as the gospel of grace. The idea was that the Jews received the gospel of the kingdom from Jesus in the past, and they will again after the tribulation begins. The Jews get the gospel of the kingdom. But in the meantime, we get the gospel of grace, which is supposed to be a different message, namely that Jesus died and rose. I have to say that's a falsehood. And these verses will yet change the whole face of theology. Acts 20, verses 24 and 25, where we have this in 24. Paul says, resuming his, talking about his career, explaining what he's been trying to do all of his life, I went about preaching the gospel of the grace of God, he says. In the very next verse he says, and as I went about preaching the kingdom. The one is the other. There's no difference at all. The gospel of the grace of God is the gospel of the kingdom. It's the gracious offer of God to give us the kingdom. Fear not, little flock, Jesus said. It's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom, right? That's grace. It's all grace. It's very gracious of God to offer us a kingdom and immortality. So it's a falsehood to say that the gospel of grace is not the same as the gospel of the kingdom. Bruce puts it this way. F.F. Bruce, the famous F.F. Bruce, in his commentary on the Greek text of Acts, it is evident, F.F. Bruce said, that the preaching of the gospel of grace is identical with the preaching of the gospel of the kingdom. Proclaiming the kingdom is the same as testifying to the gospel of God's grace. I wish that were emblazoned in the records of every church, because it would save an awful lot of confusion. People need to understand that God's kingdom gospel is the same as God's offer. Did you stay with Jesus now? Is it too much to ask people to believe what Jesus believed? Our people say, I believe in Jesus, by which they mean I believe he died for my sins and rose. That's fine. It's a beginning. But you've got to do a bit more than that. You've got to believe in what Jesus believed. You cannot believe in a person and then deny his message. The separation of Jesus from his kingdom message is, in my opinion, the disaster that has hit theology, that was never reformed at the Reformation. It's futile to say, I believe in Jesus, if you don't believe in what Jesus believed and taught.
Now that's good news. For more information on this and other issues of theological interest, visit us online at www.restorationfellowship.org. Also, for further reading on this subject, look for the following books: The Coming Kingdom of the Messiah, A Solution to the Riddle of the New Testament, by Sir Anthony Buzzard. They Never Told Me This in Church, by Pastor Greg Dybel. And The Amazing Aims and Claims of Jesus, What You Didn't Learn in Church, by Sir Anthony Buzzard.